Spring 1943, RAF Debden Airfield, England. Major Hans Dieter adjusted his Luftwaffe peaked cap and peered through the morning fog at the hulking American fighter sitting on the tarmac across the field. The P-47 Thunderbolt looked like someone had strapped wings to a beer barrel and called it an airplane. He couldn't help but smirk. "Mein Gott," he muttered to his wingman, Lieutenant Karl Weber. "The Americans think they can fight the Reich with that? It looks like a pregnant cow." Hans had been shot down over Kent 3 months prior, his Focke-Wulf 190 catching fire after a dogfight with Spitfires. Now a prisoner of war, he was being held at a facility adjacent to the American airbase. The Allies occasionally brought high-ranking Luftwaffe prisoners to observe their equipment, a psychological tactic to demonstrate Allied superiority. But as Hans watched American pilots struggle to maneuver the massive P-47 on the ground, he felt no such demoralization. 7 tons, Karl whispered, having overheard mechanics talking. 7 tons! Our 190 weighs half that. How is this supposed to turn with a Messerschmitt? Hans had flown against the best the Allies had. Spitfires that could turn on a Pfennig, RAF Hurricanes that could absorb tremendous punishment. He'd survived 3 years of aerial combat, accumulating 23 confirmed kills painted on his fighter's fuselage before his capture. He knew what made a fighter deadly, and this American machine seemed to possess none of those qualities. An American pilot walked past their guards, and Hans called out in perfect English, "Tell me, Lieutenant, does your Thunderbolt come with training wheels?" The young American pilot, he couldn't have been more than 22, turned red but kept walking. Hans chuckled. The Americans were so easy to provoke. But one pilot stopped. He was older, maybe 30, with captain's bars on his collar and eyes that had seen combat. Captain Jake Rattler Morrison had been flying P-40s in North Africa before transitioning to the Thunderbolt, and he'd learned long ago not to judge a weapon by its appearance. "You flew 1.9s, didn't you?" Morrison asked, approaching the fence. "Yeah, the finest fighter in the world," Hans replied proudly. Morrison nodded slowly. "I've tangled with 1.9s, tough birds, fast in the dive, good roll rate." He paused, looking back at his P-47. "But you know what? That pregnant cow can do something your 1.9s never could." "What's that?" "Whole freight." Hans laughed. "Keep flying when you shoot it," Morrison said quietly, and hit back 8 times harder. 3 weeks later, 25,000 feet over occupied France, Morrison's P-47, call sign Rattler 1, vibrated as the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine pushed the fighter through the thin air. Below, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned toward their target, a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt. Morrison's squadron, the 56th Fighter Group's 61st Fighter Squadron, flew top cover. "Rattler lead, this is Big Friend," crackled the voice of the bomber formation leader. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high, multiple contacts." Morrison's eyes swept the sky. There, glints of sunlight off canopies. "Rattler Squadron, bandits at 10 high. Looks like 109s and 19s. Stay with your wingmen." 12 Messerschmitt Bf-1. 09s dove toward the bomber formation, their yellow noses cutting through the sky like daggers. Behind them, 8 Focke-Wulf 190s positioned for a follow-up attack. "Here they come," Morrison said calmly. "Throttles forward. We're going to dive through them." The Thunderbolts nosed over, and Morrison felt the G-forces press him into his seat as the big fighter accelerated. This was where the P-47 excelled. The massive radial engine and heavy airframe meant it could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and keep diving without the wings tearing off. The airspeed indicator wound past 450 miles per hour. The 109s, committed to their attack run on the bombers, didn't see the Thunderbolts until too late. Morrison centered his gun sight on a 109 attacking a B-17. 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, roared to life. The P-47 shuddered from the recoil. The .50 caliber rounds were devastating at close range, each bullet the size of a man's thumb, capable of tearing through aluminum, engine blocks, and steel armor. The 109 came apart. Pieces of cowling, canopy, and wing flew off like confetti. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke and fire. "Splash one!" Morrison called, pulling up hard. The P-47 groaned under the G-forces, but held together. Another advantage of its heavyweight construction, his wingman, Lieutenant Bobby Chen, hammered another 109 that tried to follow Morrison's zoom climb. The combined firepower from 16.50 caliber guns literally sawed the German fighter in half. But the Focke-Wulf 190s were coming now, and they were flown by veterans. Morrison recognized their tactics immediately, slashing attacks using their excellent roll rate and dive speed. A 190 flashed past his canopy, cannon shells sparking off his wing. Morrison felt the impacts, heavy thumps that shook the airframe. But the P-47's construction was legendary. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because it could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. Morrison snap-rolled and dove, using the P-47's weight to gain speed. The 190 pilot tried to follow, but couldn't match the dive speed. At 500 miles per hour, Morrison pulled up hard, the G-forces graying his vision. He looked back. The 190 was still diving, but now Morrison had altitude advantage. "Gotcha," he whispered, rolling inverted and pulling through, dropping behind the German fighter. The 190 pilot saw him and snap-rolled right, then left, then tried to scissor. But the P-47, despite its bulk, had a surprising turn radius at high speed. And Morrison's 2 years of combat experience told him exactly where the German would be. He squeezed the trigger. 8 streams of tracer fire converged on the 190's fuselage. The effect was catastrophic. The German fighter's engine exploded, oil and coolant spraying across Morrison's windscreen. The 190 nosed over and entered a death spin. "Rattler lead to all rattlers. Bombers are clear. Reform on me." Morrison circled as his squadron reassembled. All 12 P-47s were still flying, though several showed battle damage. They'd splashed 8 German fighters without a single loss. As they turned for home, Morrison thought about the German pilot who'd mocked his aircraft. He wondered if that Luftwaffe major was watching today's gun camera footage. Probably not. But somewhere over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were learning a hard lesson. The Thunderbolt had arrived. 2 months later, Debden POW facility Hans Dieter sat in the common room with other Luftwaffe prisoners, listening to newly captured pilots share stories of the air war. The news wasn't good. "The Thunderbolt is everywhere now," said Hauptmann Friedrich Mayer, shot down just 3 days prior. His arm was in a sling, his face still bruised from the crash landing. "They escort the bombers all the way to the target now. We can't get through them." "Surely they can't turn with a 109, Hans said dismissively. "Just get them into a turning fight." Friedrich's laugh was bitter. "Turn with them? You don't understand. They don't turn with us. They dive on us at 500, 550 miles per hour. By the time you see them, they're already firing. Those 8.50 calibers, got him Himmel. They tear fighters apart like paper." Another pilot, Oberleutnant Stefan Koch, nodded grimly. "I saw one take on 3 1-9s at once. We hit it. I know we hit it. I saw the impacts. But it just kept flying. And then it killed all 3 of us. I was the only one who made it out." "How?" Carl asked. "I ran," Stefan said simply. "Dove for the deck at full throttle and didn't look back. The Thunderbolt didn't follow. It went back to the bombers." Hans frowned. This didn't match what he'd expected. "They're just dive and zoom attacks. Once they lose altitude advantage..." "They climb back up," Friedrich interrupted. "That massive engine, 2,000 horsepower. They climb like homesick angels. You can't catch them, can't outrun them, can't outdive them. And if you hit them, they absorb the damage and hit back." The room fell silent. These were veteran pilots, men who'd fought over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. To hear them speak with such respect and fear of an American fighter was sobering. A British guard approached with newspapers. "Thought you boys might want to read about your friends," he said, not unkindly. He laid down several copies of American military newspapers. Hans picked one up. The headline read, "Thunderbolt Ace Survives Impossible Odds." The story described Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a P-47 pilot who'd been jumped by a German ace and hit over 200 times. His fighter had been shot to pieces, engine damage, hydraulics gone, half the tail shot away. Johnson had managed to fly his crippled Thunderbolt back across the English Channel and land. The article included photos. Hans stared at the bullet-riddled P-47. It looked like Swiss cheese. No fighter should have survived that kind of damage. Certainly no one, 109 or 190, could have. "Unmöglich," he whispered. "Impossible." But there was the evidence in black and white photography. October 1943, over Münster, Germany. Oberstleutnant Hans Vogel was one of the Luftwaffe's best. 38 kills, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and a reputation for tactical brilliance. He led a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s, all flown by veterans with at least 15 kills each. They'd been scrambled to intercept an American bomber formation, B-17s heading for industrial targets in the Ruhr. Intelligence said the bombers had Thunderbolt escort, but Vogel wasn't concerned. He'd developed tactics specifically for dealing with the heavy American fighters. Listen carefully, he briefed his pilots. The Thunderbolts are fast in the dive, but heavy. If they commit to attacking us, half of you draw them low. Make them burn fuel and altitude. The rest will hit the bombers while they're engaged. It was sound strategy. The Thunderbolts couldn't be everywhere at once. They spotted the bomber formation at 23,000 feet, 40 B-17s in tight defensive boxes, with 16 P-47s flying cover above and to the sides. Vogel smiled. He had 24 190s. The odds were good. Begin the attack. Gruppa 1, engage the fighters. Gruppa 2, hit the bombers. 12 190s climbed toward the Thunderbolts, while Vogel led the other 12 in a slashing attack on the bombers. This was where the 190 excelled, fast diving attacks that gave gunners minimal time to track. But something unexpected happened. The Thunderbolts didn't commit to chasing the first group of 190. Instead, they split, 8 staying high to maintain altitude advantage, 8 diving to intercept Vogel's attack on the bombers. "Break! Break!" Vogel called as tracers suddenly filled the air around him. A P-47 had appeared from nowhere, diving at incredible speed. Cannon shells meant for a B-17 now chased Vogel's 190 instead. He snap-rolled and dove, standard evasion tactics. But the Thunderbolt stayed with him, at 450 miles per hour, at 480, at 500. How? Vogel thought frantically. The 190 was supposed to be one of the fastest fighters in a dive. He pulled up hard, trying to use the 190's better power-to-weight ratio. But the Thunderbolt pilot anticipated it, zooming up in a vertical climb that matched Vogel's despite the P-47's greater weight. And then came the guns. 8.50 caliber machine guns opened fire at 300 yards. At that range, the cone of fire was as wide as Vogel's entire fighter. He felt impacts hammer his aircraft. The armored glass behind his head cracked. The canopy shattered. His radio exploded in sparks. Vogel rolled desperately, using every trick he learned in 4 years of combat. But the P-47 pilot was good, very good, and the Thunderbolt's 8 guns gave him a margin for error that single cannon fighters didn't have. More impacts. His engine began trailing smoke. Oil splattered across what remained of his windscreen. The 190 shuddered and began losing power. Vogel pulled the canopy jettison handle and prepared to bail out. As his parachute deployed and the air battle raged around him, he watched his attackers, no, his victor, climbing back to altitude to rejoin the bomber formation. The Thunderbolt's engine sang a deep, powerful note that echoed across the sky. On its fuselage, Vogel could see kill markings, many kill markings. He floated down toward occupied German territory, alive but defeated, watching the American bombers continue to their target, unmolested now that the Luftwaffe's attack had been broken. November 1943, Debden POW facility Hans Dieter watched the guards escort a new prisoner into the compound. The man walked stiffly, his arm bandaged, his uniform torn and blood-stained, but he walked with the bearing of a professional officer. It was Hans Vogel. Hans recognized him immediately. Every Luftwaffe pilot knew Vogel's reputation. To see him here, a prisoner, was shocking. That evening, the pilots gathered as they always did, sharing news and rumors. Vogel sat quietly at first, smoking a cigarette someone had provided. "What happened?" Hans finally asked. Vogel looked at him. The Thunderbolt happened. He described the engagement, the speed, the tactics, the devastating firepower. "I hit him," Vogel said. "I saw my round strike his engine cowling, but he didn't even flinch, just kept coming. And those guns," he shook his head, 8 machine guns. "It's like flying through a metal storm. We heard they're escorting bombers all the way to Berlin now," another pilot said. Vogel nodded. "I believe it. The range on those fighters is remarkable. And they're not just escorts anymore. They're hunting us. Sweeps ahead of the bombers, clearing the sky." Hans thought back to that foggy morning months ago when he'd mocked the P-47, the pregnant cow, the beer barrel with wings. He felt ashamed of his arrogance. "I underestimated them," he said quietly. "We all did." "It's more than the aircraft," Vogel said. "It's the combination. The Americans have unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition. Their pilots learn from mistakes because enough survive to pass on lessons. And that aircraft," he paused, "it's designed for one purpose, to win a war of attrition, not to be elegant, not to be the best dogfighter, but to escort bombers to Germany and back, every day, surviving everything we throw at it and killing us in the process." The room was quiet. These men had grown up in the Luftwaffe, in an air force that prized elegance and individual skill. The idea that raw firepower and durability could triumph over finesse was difficult to accept, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. December 1943, over Osnabrück, Germany. Captain Jake Morrison was tired. His squadron had flown missions every day for the past 2 weeks. Deep penetration raids into Germany, facing swarms of Luftwaffe fighters that grew more desperate with each passing day. But today felt different. Rattler lead, bandits 12 o'clock high, looks like at least 30 plus, his wingman called. Morrison looked up. A massive formation of German fighters, 109s, 190s, even some twin-engine Me-410s with their heavy cannons, was diving toward the bomber formation. All Rattlers prepare to engage. Thunderbolt 17 and 18, stay with the bombers. Everyone else, we're going hunting. The P-47s advanced throttles to full power, their massive engines roaring. Morrison selected a 109 that was lining up on a B-17 and dove. The Messerschmitt pilot saw him coming and tried to break off the attack, but it was too late. Morrison's 8.50 calibers roared, and the 109 disintegrated in a cloud of debris. But there were so many German fighters. Morrison snap-rolled to avoid a head-on attack from a 190, felt his P-47 shudder as cannon shells hit somewhere behind him. He checked his instruments, everything still green. The Thunderbolt kept flying. He pulled up hard into a vertical climb, using the P-47's powerful engine to gain altitude. The 190 tried to follow but stalled out. Morrison rolled over the top and dove back down, this time with perfect position. His guns spoke again. The 190 caught fire and spiraled away. "Rattler 3 is hit," someone called. Morrison looked left and saw Lieutenant Hernandez's P-47 trailing smoke, losing altitude. "Hernandez, status?" "Engine's rough, but I'm flying. Heading for the deck." Morrison knew what that meant. Getting low, following roads and rivers back to friendly territory. It was dangerous, but Hernandez was a good pilot. He'd make it. Meanwhile, the air battle raged on. Morrison found himself in a turning fight with a 190, something he usually avoided. But the German pilot was skilled, matching every move. They spiraled down from 20,000 feet to 15,000, neither gaining advantage. Then Morrison remembered something a Navy pilot had told him in North Africa. When you can't outmaneuver them, out-engine them. He shoved the throttle to the firewall and pulled up sharply, almost into a loop. The P-47's massive engine clawed for altitude despite the punishing G-forces. The 190 pilot tried to follow, but the lower-powered BMW engine couldn't maintain the climb. Morrison reached the top of his loop, rolled inverted, and dove back down. Now he had both altitude and speed. The 190 was directly below, still trying to climb. It wasn't even a fair fight. 8.50 caliber guns fired for 3 seconds. The 190 exploded. Morrison's radio crackled with reports from other pilots. Kills, damage, status updates. The Luftwaffe attack had been broken. The bombers were continuing to target. As Morrison climbed back to escort altitude, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline, he counted his ammunition. Less than 100 rounds per gun remaining. He'd need to be careful if they faced another attack. But the sky remained clear. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything they had at this raid, and the Thunderbolts had stopped them cold. January 1944, Debden POW facility. The common room had grown crowded. Every week brought new prisoners, pilots shot down by Thunderbolts, or by Mustangs, or by Spitfires. But increasingly, it was the P-47s that the pilots talked about. Hans Dieter had been a prisoner for nearly a year now. He'd watched the air war turn against Germany through the stories of captured pilots, each wave bringing worse news. Today, a young pilot, he couldn't have been more than 19, sat with his head in his hands, crying. His first mission had been his last. A Thunderbolt had shot him down before he'd even fired his guns. Hans sat beside him. "What's your name, son?" "Otto. Otto Becker." "Tell me what happened." Otto wiped his eyes. "We were supposed to hit the bombers. My flight leader said to stay with him, stay close. But then they came. The Thunderbolts. 3 of them. I saw my flight leader's plane explode, then my wingman. I tried to run, but they were so fast. One of them caught me. I felt the impacts. My fighter was shaking apart, and I bailed out." Hans nodded. He'd heard variations of this story dozens of times now. "From mission start to bailout, maybe 5 minutes," Otto continued. 5 minutes. That's all I lasted. An older pilot, Major Wilhelm Schneider, spoke up. 5 minutes is better than some. The Luftwaffe is sending up Gruppe leaders with 50-60 kills to fly against Americans with 400 hours of training and aircraft that can absorb damage and hit back. We're losing experienced pilots every day. And they're not, Hans said quietly. Everyone looked at him. The Americans. Their pilots survive because those fighters bring them home, even when shot to pieces. They learn. They get better. Meanwhile, we lose our best and replace them with boys on their first mission. The room fell silent again. It was a truth everyone knew, but few spoke aloud. I mocked the Thunderbolt once, Hans continued, called it a pregnant cow, laughed at how big and heavy it was. He looked around at the assembled pilots. Now I think maybe the Americans understood something we didn't. They built a fighter that protects its pilot, that survives, that wins not through elegance but through sheer capability. Vogel, sitting in the corner, spoke up. I've been thinking about this, about why the Thunderbolt works. It's not just the aircraft, it's the entire system. American industry can replace losses faster than we can shoot them down. Their training pipeline produces good pilots in quantity. Their fuel supply is unlimited. And that aircraft, that massive, ugly, brutally effective aircraft, is the perfect weapon for this kind of war. A war of attrition, Hans said. Yes, and in a war of attrition, the side that can lose 100 fighters and replace them with 200 always wins. March 1944, over Brunswick, Germany. Major Jake Morrison, he'd been promoted after his 10th confirmed kill, led his squadron through thin clouds at 28,000 feet. This was his 53rd mission, and he was tired. Not just physically, though the daily flights at high altitude took their toll. He was tired of killing, tired of watching friends go down, tired of the grinding horror of aerial combat. But the mission continued. Today's target was a fighter production facility. If the intelligence was correct, this factory produced Focke-Wulf 190s, the same aircraft that had killed 3 of his friends in the past month. Rattler lead, this is Big Friend. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, looks like a major formation. Morrison spotted them, at least 50 German fighters assembling for an attack. All Rattlers, here we go again. Let's keep them off the bombers. The P-47s accelerated, climbing to meet the threat. Morrison felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the narrowing of perception that came with combat. His hands moved automatically, charging guns, adjusting fuel mixture, scanning for threats. The German formation split, a classic tactic, some fighters to draw off the escorts, others to hit the bombers. But Morrison had seen this before. Rattler Squadron, maintain formation. They want to split us up. Don't let them. The Thunderbolts stayed together, a wall of 8 deadly fighters between the Luftwaffe and the B-17s. When German fighters tried to break through, they met concentrated fire from multiple P-47s. Morrison found himself in a head-on attack with a 109. Both pilots opened fire simultaneously. Tracers crossed in the space between them. Morrison felt impacts. His windscreen cracked. Something exploded behind his seat. But the Thunderbolt kept flying. The 109 didn't. It nosed over, streaming coolant, and fell away. Rattler lead, you're streaming fuel, his wingman called. Morrison checked his gauges. Sure enough, his main tank had been holed. He was losing fuel fast. Quick calculation, not enough to make it home. Rattler 2, take over the lead. I'm going to have to put her down. Copy, lead. Good luck. Morrison peeled off, losing altitude, heading west. Maybe he could make it to friendly lines. Maybe. He watched his fuel gauge wind down. 500 pounds, 400, 300. Below, he spotted a clear field near a small French village. Behind him, black smoke rose from the bomber's target. They'd hit it. The mission was successful. At 200 pounds of fuel, his engine started to cough. Morrison lined up his approach, landing gear down, flaps extended. The P-47 glided like a brick, but Morrison had practiced this 100 times. He touched down hard, the big fighter bouncing once, twice, then settling. He rolled to a stop in a farmer's field, 40 miles behind German lines. Morrison sat in the cockpit for a moment, breathing hard, then popped the canopy and climbed out. His P-47, his battered, bullet-riddled, fuel-leaking Thunderbolt, had gotten him this far. Now he'd have to walk the rest of the way. He patted the aircraft's nose. Thanks, old girl. Then he started walking west. August 1944, Debden POW facility. Hans Dieter heard the news through the Guard network. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. The war was coming to Germany now, and everyone knew how it would end. He stood at the fence watching P-47s take off on yet another mission. The aircraft that had once seemed comical now looked purposeful, even beautiful in its brutal efficiency. A guard approached, one of the friendlier ones, a corporal from Nebraska. "Thought you'd want to know. That American pilot who crashed behind enemy lines in March, Morrison, French resistance, got him out. He's back flying missions." Hans nodded slowly. Of course he was. That was the American way. Shot down, escaped, back to combat. The Luftwaffe had no such system, no such resilience. "How many missions has he flown?" Hans asked. "Over 70 now. 18 confirmed kills." Hans did the math in his head. 70 missions meant Morrison had flown more combat hours than most Luftwaffe pilots accumulated in their entire careers. And Morrison was just one of hundreds, thousands of American pilots, all flying aircraft that protected them, that brought them home, that let them learn and improve. "You know what I think about when I see those fighters now?" Hans said, not really talking to the guard, just speaking his thoughts aloud. "I think about how different it could have been if we built fighters to protect pilots instead of fighters to look impressive at air shows. If we'd thought about the long war instead of the quick victory." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "That's pretty deep thinking for a POW. Hans smiled without humor. "We have a lot of time to think here." The P-47s climbed into the afternoon sky, their engines singing that distinctive deep thunder that had become the soundtrack of Allied air superiority. Somewhere over Germany they would meet what remained of the Luftwaffe, and they would win because they'd been designed to win, not in single combat, not through elegance, but through the grinding arithmetic of industrial warfare. Hans had learned his lesson. He'd laughed at the Thunderbolt once, mocked its size and weight and ungainly appearance. But the P-47 had the last laugh, written in the contrails of thousands of missions, in the survival rates of pilots who came home from battles that should have killed them, in the factories and cities of Germany that burned because the bombers got through. The 8.50 caliber machine guns hadn't just rained lead on German fighters. They'd rained down the end of the Luftwaffe's dominance, the end of German air superiority, the end of the illusion that skill and aggression could triumph over industrial might and strategic planning. Hans turned away from the fence and walked back to the barracks. Tomorrow would bring more news of Allied advances, more stories of German defeats, more evidence that the war was lost. But today he'd learned something valuable. Never underestimate an opponent because their tools look different from yours. The Americans had understood what kind of war they were fighting and built the right weapon for that war. The Thunderbolt wasn't elegant, it wasn't graceful, it was just relentlessly, devastatingly effective. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The P-47 Thunderbolt served with distinction throughout World War II, flying more than 500,000 combat sorties. It claimed 3,752 aerial victories while maintaining a remarkable survival rate for its pilots. The aircraft's 8.50 caliber machine guns could fire 100 rounds per second collectively, and its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters. While initially dismissed by both Allied and Axis pilots,